Reading the Sherwood Ring by Elizabeth Marie Pope. Okay, we are on page 49 of chapter 2. And we're going to finish the chapter. All right, we're at the very end of the page. And with every week that went by, Peaceable Sherwood's martyrs grew stronger. His raids bolder, his mastery of the situation more complete and terrifying. By August, the whole district was reduced to a state of panic, with frantic citizens hooting at me and my soldiers on the road, and every rider from headquarters bringing dispatches to demand immediate and successful action. The only comfort was that the forest fire Peaceable Sherwood had kindled did not yet spread very far. The British authorities were still making no effort to set up similar organizations in other parts of the country, but this was a poor, thin consolation at best, for surely it could not possibly be long now before they started to do so. It was the first time in my life that I had tasted real failure or shame, and I found them both uncommonly hard to swallow. In my black desperation, I could not endure the faintest suggestion of help or sympathy from anybody. I even disliked riding over to New Jerusalem because the look in Barbara's eyes was becoming more than I could bear. But such was my perversity that I disliked the look in Eleanor Shipley's eyes even more. Eleanor Shipley, needless to say, was making no effort to burden me with help or sympathy over Peaceable Sherwood. Indeed, there were times when I wondered which of them would really be responsible if I put a bullet through my head. I did my best to remain very formal, very distant, very courteous when I was compelled to speak to her. I never, by the flicker of an eyelash, did I let her know that she was hurting me in the least. But the more formal, distant, and courteous I became, the more outrageously she conducted herself. I will spare you the full account of that. Also, except to say that by the end of those 10 abominable weeks, I think I would have cheerfully sold myself to the devil if he would only have allowed me to trap Peaceable Sherwood by some brilliant maneuver of my own, and made sure that a certain young lady was somewhere about to discover, when it was too late, how wrong she had been to jeer at Richard Graham. And then she'd be sorry, I muttered fiercely to myself, as I rode home to my dinner one weary August afternoon. I was feeling so wretched that the very thought of food made me sick, but anything was better than having Eleanor Shipley tell me that even dashing young heroes needed to keep up their strength. It was a blazing day, too, miserably hot and dusty, without even the promise of a thunderstorm to break the monotony. All the birds had retreated into the deep woods, and there was nobody on the road but a peddler, who had taken off his pack and was resting under the shade of a tree. Peddlers were becoming rare now that the country was so unsettled, and I reined in my horse to speak to him on a chance he might have heard some news. He was one of those slim, lean Irishmen who look as if he were made out of a carriage whip. He told me that he was traveling up the valley with needles and laces and pins and various other gewgaws for the farmers' wives, and asked me to buy one of his ribbons for his young lady. As I did not feel like explaining just why I had no young lady, I put the question aside and asked him in return if he had seen any sign of Peaceable Sherwood or his martyrs on the road. Many of the saints forbid, said the peddler, with a quick glance over one shoulder. It's ruined I'd be if it caught up with me. Maybe a hunter with woodcraft would slip easy into this terrible great forest and lie snug till they'd gone by. But what would I do that was born in Dublin and me hardly able to tell the woods from the trees, as the old saying has it? Look at that there, now," waving his hand at a white triangular gash in the bark just above his head. "No doubt a gentleman bred to this land like your honor could tell what it means. But sure it might be the blessed Latin itself, for all I can make of it." "We call it a blaze hereabouts," I explained kindly. "Somebody has been cutting it on the tree to mark a trail into the woods. Not a very good man with an axe either. See where it caught a bit off his clothes? No, over there, hanging on the end of that sliver, by the sumac." "Sure, and I thought it was a flower, the fine color of it. It's your honor has the eyes," said the peddler, reaching for the little scrap and passing it up to me. "A shame to murder the good cloth so cruel. Now, if I were back across the water in Scotland before the dreary wars, I'd say that was the piece of a tartan." I nodded as I turned the scrap over my finger to examine it in the light. The wearing of the tartan had, of course, been forbidden on Scottish soil since the last great rebellion of the clans in '45. But many of the Highlanders who had fled to the New World afterwards had brought their plaids with them. I had one myself, which I found useful in the woods when I was hunting, and my grandfather, old Enos, had taught me to know the various tartans and clan badges as strictly as if he were still at home in his hills. "Drummond," I said almost without thinking, as I looked down at the bold pattern of scarlets and yellows and whites. Then, from somewhere out of the past, I heard the echo of my own voice speaking to General Washington. "The Drummond sounds more as if she might be Scottish, sir." Perhaps Peaceable Drummond Sherwood was, or also had an old family plaid, which he found useful in the woods. Or perhaps I was simply making a fool of myself. Yet there was nobody else named Drummond in this part of the country. Most of the settlers had been Dutch. Piet Cornelius and Jos van Gent owned all the land on both sides of the road for miles around. Yet surely Peaceable Drummond Sherwood would never have been so careless as to catch his fine plaid by accident with the edge of an axe. But suppose, and I caught my breath hard at the very thought of it, suppose the scrap of tartan had not been caught there by accident. Suppose it had been left on purpose, to mark a particular trail into the woods for someone else to follow. Yet surely Peaceable Drummond Sherwood would never have marked his trail with a scrap of tartan that might as well have made his name written on it for anybody with the eyes to see. But who except himself would have had the eyes to see? 1,000 other riders might have gone by that tree without realizing the significance of the little rag caught on the sliver any more than the peddler had. Peaceable Sherwood could mark his own gate with his own name and leave it there quite safely for the public to look at. It was, now I came to think of it, exactly the sort of joke that might appeal to him. "A fair journey, to your honor," the voice of the peddler interrupted me. He had risen to his feet and was yawning and stretching and feeling about for the buckles of his pack. "The road will get no cooler for our sitting beside it, and I want to be over the hills by night. You're sure you wouldn't like to buy a fine ribbon for your young lady now? Red would adorn her if she's dark like yourself." "No, her hair is yellow, just like coppery gold," I answered absent-mindedly before I could check myself. "Have a nice bit of blue then," said the peddler winningly. In the end, I bought the blue ribbon to get rid of him, and he went away whistling a little tune. He had hardly disappeared around the first bend before I was off my horse to look at the blaze on the tree more closely. As I had thought, The trail was a fresh one. The splinters were still sharp and new, the cut in the bark still almost white. Probably this morning, certainly not before yesterday, I muttered to myself as I slipped into the wood and on to the next blazed tree like a shadow. Peaceable Sherwood, if it was indeed he, had not made much of an effort to cover his tracks. There was even a path of sorts beaten through the fallen leaves and low bushes. The path came to an abrupt end at the clearing, perhaps 100 feet in from the road. It was only a little place, all flat, mossy rocks with ferns and whispering thread of water that fell into a tiny pool where I took one abrupt step forward and stood looking down at it, while once again the hope died out of my heart. I had made a fool of myself. All my speculations about peaceable Sherwood and scrap of tartan must simply have been vaporing, for the little clearing in the woods was obviously nothing but a secret place where the child had been coming to play. Barbara and I had once had a secret place in our own woods and built ourselves a hut there. Here, there was an old doll crumpled up on the natural seat among the rocks, and a wooden ball lying under a pine farther up the slope. But what had first caught my eye was a sort of toy landscape down by the brook, where the rocks widened to leave a circle of mossy grass. A hole filled with water had been dug in the center for a lake, and moss and pebbles and pine springs were heaped about it to represent hills and rocks and trees. The child, whoever he was, must have worked hard. The little landscape was beautifully made, with a miniature peninsula at one side of the lake, and the hills rounded so naturally that for a moment I had a curious feeling that I was actually gazing at a real landscape from somewhere high in the air. The only thing that spoiled the effort was a withering maple leaf, which had been laid, for no apparent reason, over the bare ground where the hills came together at the edge of the water, except as they did at Duck's Head Lake. Then I understood suddenly why the landscape had seemed so real. The child must have modeled it after seeing the view from the big cliff down over the hills and forest to Duck's Head Lake. The peninsula on the right and the rock rising from the water on the left were just the same as those which actually did make Duck's Head Lake look from the cliff extraordinarily like the head of a duck, with the rock for an eye and the peninsula making a bill wide open to quack. But how could a child still young enough to be playing with toys have ever seen Duck's Head Lake? It was up the mountain, at least 4 hours' journey away, even for a grown and wood-wise man, in the very heart of the forest. Only hunters had ever gone there, and since the war even the hunters must have stopped coming. It was too dangerous in the present state of the country, when any such lovely place might be the lurking hole of murderers like Peaceable Sherwood, or like Peaceable Sherwood. Peaceable Sherwood, and that scrap of tartan which I had thought must be meant to mark a trail for someone to follow. A trail for someone to follow. Follow where? I looked from the scrap of tartan to the toy landscape, my mind working feverishly. Once again, my eyes were caught by that singular maple leaf lying so awkwardly at the edge of the little lake. There was no reason why it should be there. Had it simply blown off down a tree, or... I stooped and picked it up. Underneath, someone had packed the ground with water into a smooth square of mud, and then, while the mud was still wet, he had stamped it with a signet ring as if it were the seal of a letter. The mud had dried hard, and the impression was still perfect. A shield, blank except for 3 little rayed stars in the upper left corner. I sat down on the nearest ledge of rock I began to laugh almost hysterically out of sheer triumph and relief. I knew what must have happened now. Everything was becoming clear to me. I went on sitting on the rock and worked it all out step by step. The scrap of tartan was a signal. A man who had been told to watch for it could slip quietly off the road as he passed and make his way up the blazed trail to the little clearing. There he would find what was actually an excellent relief map, showing him that he was to go on to Duck's Head Lake. The mark of the signet ring in the mud indicated the exact spot where he was to look for Peaceable Sherwood. And how beautifully simple the whole thing was. No letters that might be captured or stolen. No word-of-mouth messages that might be garbled or forgotten. Nothing that could possibly arouse a shadow of suspicion. Who else would have seen anything amiss with a scrap of tartan? And even if he did, it would only be to find, as I had, that he had stumbled on nothing but a perfectly innocent plaything constructed by some lonely child. That old doll crumpled up among the rocks was enough to touch the hardest heart. Meanwhile, just how many men had come and gone and received their directions since yesterday or this morning? Not, I thought, very many. 1 or 2 maybe, but 10 or even 5, no matter how cautious they were, would have left more marks in the woods than I had found, and I did not think from the look of the trail that anyone was trying to be excessively cautious. Perhaps they had not yet all arrived, or perhaps this was some special meeting arranged for only 1 or 2 chosen lieutenants. Perhaps, oh glory, oh possibility, I was still ahead of the whole field, and if I just got to the rendezvous at Duck's Head Lake quickly enough, Peaceable Sherwood would be waiting there alone. I came to my feet and out of the clearing in one passionate rush, remembering somehow to kick the toy landscape to pieces with my boot as I went by. The scrap of tartan was already in my pocket, and I paused when I had mounted my horse to pull a trail of wild grapevine down over the blaze of the tree. It did not matter how many men came looking for it now. They would have no way of finding out where to go. At most, there would be only 1 or 2 with Peaceable Sherwood at Duck's Head Lake, and a chance, more than a fair chance, that there would be nobody at all, and I could have him entirely to myself at last. A voice of common sense still kept making itself heard fretfully from time to time above the clatter of my horse's hooves as I pelted up the mountain road as fast as I could go. It went whining on in a nagging way that I could not be absolutely certain of taking Peaceable Sherwood single-handed, especially if he had even 1 or 2 followers with him. And it was imperative to take Peaceable Sherwood. Without him, his whole organization would fall apart like beads when the string is pulled out. What I ought to do was return to the Shipley farm first and come back with 10 or 15 men of my own in order to make sure. But the Shipley farm was a good 5 miles in the opposite direction. By the time I got there and rounded up my reinforcements and returned, Peaceable Sherwood would probably either have finished his business or else become tired of waiting and escaped me again. Besides, dry mouth. Besides, if there was any more delay, I could not hope to reach Duck's Head Lake much before night, and I did not want to go thrashing through a strange forest with 15 rangers looking for Peaceable Sherwood in the dark. 15 Rangers would undoubtedly make too much noise, even in broad daylight. It was actually wiser to take care of the whole matter itself. It was a better tracker than anyone else in the company, except possibly Lieutenant Felton. And Lieutenant Felton was sickening at the moment with a touch of malaria. It would really not be fair to drag him out for such a long expedition on such a stifling afternoon. Anyway, I was going to take Peaceable Sherwood single-handed if it killed me, and that was the end of the question. I would no longer put up with being harried or defeated and mocked as I had been that summer. I wanted to ride triumphantly back to the Shipley farm with Peaceable Sherwood tied to my stirrup and find Eleanor Shipley standing at the gate again to watch me come in. By this time, I was well up the mountain, where the road turned first into the rough trail and then petered out altogether. My horse had begun to stumble with weariness too, and I patted him apologetically when I dismounted to cut through the rest of the forest on foot. "Cheer up, old boy. We'll both be famous in the morning," I said, as I saw to his needs before I left him. "People will be pulling hairs out of your tail to remember us by." Once afoot in the forest, the going was slower, especially as I had only been in the region twice before on hunting trips, and I did not remember the landmarks very clearly. I had also been rather foolish not to go back to the Shipley farm for my moccasins and hunting shirt. My riding boots were hot and uncomfortable for walking, and my buff and blue uniform would have made a fine target for any martyr who happened to catch sight of me among the trees. My sword kept getting in the way too, and it was my only weapon. Mercifully, however, there seemed to be nobody abroad in the forest. By using every ounce of woodcraft I possessed, I managed to make fair speed. All the same, it was almost evening by the time I came through the last of the pine trees and out under the great rock fall where the hills came together at the edge of Duck's Head Lake. The sun was going down in the west, all crimson and gold, and the clear waters of the lake rippled with dissolving colors that melted into dark greens and blacks under the shadow of the towering rocks. Standing on the highest rock, apparently watching the sunset, was a figure in a scarlet uniform, exactly where the signet on the toy landscape had indicated that he would be. It was the first time I had ever seen him, and for a moment I could hardly bring myself to believe that he was really Peaceable Sherwood at all. He looked so different from anything I had imagined. He was very slender and extremely young, even younger than I was, with blue eyes and a gentle, curiously calm expression. He stood leaning against a ledge of the rock with an air of careless elegance, as if it were the back of a drawing-room chair, and gazing dreamily down at the dissolving colors in the sunlit water. Then a twig snapped under my foot as I took an incautious step forward, and I saw him look up. "That you, Timothy?" he said, without so much as turning his head. He had a lazy, rather drawling voice, and spoke as if he were almost too great an effort to bother. I came out from under the shelter of the pines and stood squarely across the only place where it was possible to clamber down from the rock. "It isn't Timothy," I answered. Peaceable Sherwood stiffened, and for an instant seemed to become absolutely still. But when he spoke again, his voice sounded only mildly surprised, like a gentleman receiving an unexpected visit from some casual acquaintance. "Colonel Graham, I believe?" he inquired courteously. "Won't you come up? Be careful of your riding boots. That rock's slippery. I sometimes think that if I belonged to this country, I would much prefer moccasins and hunting shirt for work in the woods. As it is, I have to live night and day in this confoundedly uncomfortable uniform to prevent the public from hanging me as a spy when you catch me. Do come up." Rather taken aback by all this cordiality, I went scrambling across the rocks to him, with a wary eye out for some possible trap or ambush. Peaceable Sherwood merely laughed and shook his head. "No, I didn't bring anyone with me," he assured me. "There are times when I find the company of even very superior outlaws like my own a little tedious. I fancy all those endless ballads about Robin Hood and his merry men under the greenwood shaws must have been written by virtuous citizens who never even went out of the house. They should have seen old Timothy sitting under a maple tree and eating trout with his fingers. By the way, I hope that nothing is amiss with old Timothy. He had a rather important engagement to meet me here with some other lads in an hour or so." "We didn't capture him, if that's what you mean," I told him. "He's probably still just trying to find out where you are. I took that scrap of Drummond tartan off the tree and kicked apart your landscape map in the clearing." For some mysterious reason, he seemed to be talking together as easily as if we had known one another all our lives. Peaceable nodded. "So you noticed Drummond tartan," he said a little ruefully. "I should have remembered your name was Graham before I went running my old mithers plaid in that shocking manner. I dare say you were raised on that sort of thing, from the cradle, so to speak. Still, I feel the idea was basically a sound one, and that child's playground with the little landscapes had really been useful to me for a long time. Now I suppose I'll have to think of something else." "That will be quite unnecessary," I said firmly. "You are coming with me." Peaceable Sherwood did not seem startled or alarmed in the least. The look he gave me was simply one of polite question. "Am I?" he said. "Now, just how are you proposing to go about that, I wonder?" He sounded as if he were only vaguely interested in the problem. "I observe that you are not carrying a pistol, and this rock is really quite unsuited to swordsplay. Surely you don't mean to overcome me with your bare hands. I detest wrestling matches." "That's regrettable," I answered politely, and reached for him. It was like taking hold of a flash of lightning. Peaceable Sherwood met my attack with one crashing blow that shuddered up my whole arm and almost sent me off my feet. And then I was down by the edge of the rock fighting for my life against a murderous fury that seemed to be made entirely of whipcord and steel. For one precarious instant, we struggled desperately. Then I felt the heel of my boot slide on the treacherous, slippery rock, and there was a whirling rush, and I went hurtling through the air into a crashing greenness of pine bogs that closed over me and went black. When I came to myself again, it was still fairly dark, and the light of the moon was flickering through the branches above me. Someone had thoughtfully removed my coat and rolled it up to make a rough pillow for my head. But when I tottered uncertainly to my feet, Peaceable Sherwood was no longer standing on the rock, and there was not even the rustle of a leaf in the forest to show which way he had gone. It must have been almost 4 o'clock in the morning when I finally got up to the Shipley farm. Somewhere a sleepy cock was beginning to crow, and all the eastern horizon was luminously green with the coming dawn. But it was still black night under the great elm trees by the porch as I let myself into the shadowy hall and went blundering towards my room in the dark. "Dick?" said the whispering voice somewhere above my head. "Dick, is that you?" Eleanor Shipley was coming down the wide stairway, carrying a lighted candle in one hand. The glow shone on the butterfly blue of her dress, and her white throat, and the coppery glints in her hair. "Why are you up?" I whispered back. I was so weary that my voice seemed to come from a long way off, as if it belonged to somebody else. I reached uncertainly for the newel post at the foot of the stairs and steadied myself on it. "Why are you up? Is Felton worse?" "No, but I expected you back this afternoon. And when you didn't come, I thought, why, Dick?" She broke off sharply and leaned over the banister with a sudden exclamation to look down at me. "Dick, what is it? Are you hurt? Where have you been all this time? You look like death. What's the matter with you?" I went on standing there stupidly, looking straight ahead of me, not at her, but at the little flame of the candle she was carrying. My voice, when I answered her, still sounded as if it was coming from a long way off. It seemed to be speaking quietly and dispassionately about another person I neither knew very well nor liked very much. "I have been behaving like an arrogant fool that I am," the voice said. "I found out by chance today that Peaceable Sherwood is going to Duckhead's Lake to meet some of his followers. I followed him there alone instead of coming back here first to get some help. I told myself that I wouldn't spare the time, and the rangers might blunder, and Felton was sick. I was only making excuses for my own pride and folly and spite. I wanted to take him single-handed as if I were a prince in a fairy tale, and have you looking up at me at last and telling me what I wonder you thought I was." The voice paused an instant, on a sort of painful breath, and then went on again, even more carefully than before. We fought, and my foot slipped because I was wearing my riding boots, like a fool, and he knocked me off the rocks and got clean away because there wasn't anyone else there to stop him. Now, I don't suppose we will ever catch him. And General Washington said that I had been recommended to him as an officer with the intelligence and ability needed to carry out a very important mission. Intelligence and ability. Isn't that amusing? I turned my head a little to look up at her. "I see now why you found me so laughable all these years." Eleanor was not laughing. To my astonishment, her face was suddenly become a sort of blazing white, and she was so angry that there were actual tears of rage in her eyes. I had not seen her look like that since she was 10 years old and flying like a fury at Johnny Tacklock for bullying a small boy much younger than he was. She reached out her hand and caught me hard by the shoulder. "You stop," she said, stamping her foot. "You stop talking about yourself that way. I won't have it. I won't have it. Do you hear me?" "But Eleanor," I stammered, almost as completely taken aback as Johnny Tatlock had been in his time. "Be quiet," said Eleanor fiercely. "I suppose you think you know more about your own intelligence and ability than General Washington does? Never catch Peaceable Sherwood, indeed. Of all the nonsense, who almost caught him only tonight? You would probably have caught him if your boot only hadn't slipped on the rock. And who cares about a silly old boot? It was my fault anyway." "Your fault?" I was beginning to feel that my plunge from the rock must really have unsettled my wits. "For driving you crazy with my pestering the way I have," Eleanor cried. "I knew it was wrong, and I shouldn't have done it, but you never would pay any attention to me, and you were always so formal and distant and courteous, and I was only trying to show you—" "Show me what, exactly?" "Oh, be quiet," said Eleanor again, two furious tears spilling over her lashes and falling hotly on my hand. "You always treat me like that, even when you were a boy. You know you do. You did." But I thought you didn't like me, I said numbly. You were always laughing and trying to catch me out and making fun of me. You know you were. At least you might admit it was you who began it. I never did any such thing. I tell you, I thought you didn't like me. Like you, Eleanor wailed. I did everything but stand on my head trying to make you take the smallest notice of me. I know I kept talking about your arrogance and your stupidity and your airs, but all the time I would have followed you to China at the hint of a kindness. And when I saw you riding down the road on your horse this spring, I thought you the most. It was at that moment I began to laugh. Eleanor, I warn you that if you call me a dashing young hero just once more, I shall probably fell you to the earth. Eleanor began to laugh too, and we both stood there idiotically, with our hands linked over the banister, laughing at one another. Then, still laughing, she suddenly bent down to me, and for an instant I felt the mocking mouth brush across my cheek, as lightly as a butterfly's wing. The next instant she had pulled her hand out of mine and was running away up the stairs. The second Richard Graham sat looking at the garden for a moment, apparently lost in some pleasant memory. Then he turned his head and smiled at me. I told you it was a sad story, he said, but at least it has a happy ending, and incidentally teaches a useful moral lesson which should prove of great value to your future career. I felt myself coloring a little guiltily. If you're thinking about Pat, I began. Well, as a matter of fact, I was, said Richard Graham. You were planning to show him something, I believe, because you have your pride. I thought so. Do let me assure you from my own personal experience that it is a most unsatisfactory method of attracting attention. It's only that I haven't heard from him at all, I defended myself. I don't even know where he is. I expect you'll find out all in good time, said Richard Graham offhandedly. Maybe he's just sick of us, I suggested rather dolefully. I can't understand why Uncle Enos won't make friends with him or even utter a word about him. I expect you'll find that out all in good time, too. He had risen to his feet and was moving away towards the other end of the library, where the shadows were so thick I could barely distinguish him. Oh, wait, please, I begged him. Just tell me one more thing. Did you ever catch Peaceable Sherwood? This time there was no answer.